Giving it a couple seconds for participants to be let in from the waiting room, and then we'll get started. I'd like to welcome you to the next session at the Purpose-Driven Business Summit. You're in for a real treat because today we're going to be hearing from Tom Dawkins, who is co-founder and CEO of StartSomeGood. It's a certified B Corp located in Sydney, Australia. As I mentioned this morning, Tom ended up being out of town this week, so was unable to join us live, but he graciously loaned us a recording that he made a couple weeks ago with all the same content that I was going to have him share with us live during the summit. So I've heard it. I think it's great. I think you're going to really like what Tom has to share with you. So Start Something Good, let me just tell you a little bit about that. They're all about helping people design and launch social enterprises and impact projects. You know, there's a little bit of distinction in language, but social enterprise, purpose-driven business, you know, it's kind of all in the same ball of wax, impact business. So don't want you to get too hung up on languaging. But what he's going to share is the social enterprise formula based on the work they've been doing for 8 or 9 years. So they've got two main ways that they help do this. One is they have the Good Hustle program, which I actually participated in after I heard Tom give a talk pretty much like the one you're going to hear today, because I knew they had a lot of great information, and I love the typology and the way he views the different kinds of social enterprises or purpose-driven businesses. It helped really crystallize it for me. So I think you're going to really like hearing from him. And the other way that they support getting social enterprises off the ground is they actually have a crowdfunding platform that they offer to folks that are kind of in this niche. They really understand what it takes to get social enterprises and impact projects off the ground. So they've specialized in that. And because, like I say, they understand it in a way that a lot of typical crowdfunding may or may not fully get. So without further ado, I'm gonna turn on his recording, but a couple of things in advance. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a chat button. And I really want to encourage you, as we're going through and listening to what Tom has to share, if any questions come up, please type them in the chat and I'll make sure he gets those. We're still trying to figure out if he's going to be able to be available to do a live Q&A either on Facebook or Zoom, and I'll keep you posted about that. But for now, feel free, as any questions come up, put them in the chat and we'll make sure you get some answers for those. So I'm gonna share my screen and get the recording going, and hopefully it'll go smoothly. Earlier today, I had a few problems with it, so keep your fingers crossed. Okay, here we go. Oop. That's what I was afraid of, no sound. So let me try this again. I'm gonna quit this and reopen it. Somehow Zoom and the way I've been playing the video, it doesn't seem like it likes talking to each other. So let me give it another shot here. It worked 50% of the time earlier today, so I'm hopeful we'll get it going. Let me just do a couple things here. Open up the file again. I never like to see that little beach ball thing. That's never a good sign. Okay. Not Tom. That won't come up with anything. Thanks for your patience. Okay, there we go. It's worth waiting for.
So my name is Tom. I'm the co-founder and CEO of StartSomeGood.com. StartSomeGood is a crowdfunding platform and innovation and education agency that works to increase the pace of innovation for change. So our passion and our mission and our work is all about supporting people to refine their ideas, to develop their plans, and to actually put their initiatives and projects that make a difference in the world, to turn them from ideas into action, and ultimately to help you to make an impact. We've done that for the last 9 years at our crowdfunding platform at StartSomeGood.com, where we've helped over 1,000 projects successfully launch. And about a year ago, we launched the Good Hustle program, which is our social enterprise design program. So we'll be touching on some of the key ideas from that program in the presentation today, but also just giving an overview, based on all the work we've done over these last 10 years, as to what we think is going on in the social enterprise sector and where we think it's going and why we think it's such a unique moment for you to be thinking about creating, launching, or growing a social enterprise. And so I want to cover 3 big things today, and obviously I'll be moving through these relatively quickly as we go. It's designed to give an overview, but also designed to give, I hope, some really practical tips as to where you might need to focus on and what you might need to do next in order to realize your own social enterprise ambitions. And so first I want to talk about what is a social enterprise, because people use the phrase to mean somewhat different things. And I want to kind of and there's, I think, some confusion as to what we're talking about when we talk about social enterprise. So I want to demystify that. I'll tell you how we think about it at StartSomeGood in everything we do. Then I want to talk about why social enterprises are growing so rapidly right now. Whatever we call them, I think there is consensus that this thing called social enterprise, whatever that is growing and becoming more significant and a more important part of our economy, but also a more important part of how we make change today. And I want to discuss, I guess, some of the historical trends that I think have given rise to that. And then finally, I want to touch on how can you go about launching a social enterprise? What are some of the key pieces that you need to get in place in order to successfully launch your idea or grow your idea? And just as a reminder for the people who just joined us since I last said this, any questions you have, please put them in the chat, and I will do my very best to keep an eye on the chat as I present. And we'll try and thread answers to those questions into the presentation as we go. If I don't get to them, there'll be some time at the end. So first, what is a social enterprise? So people use this phrase to mean a number of different things, but we use it to mean something pretty simple at StartSomeGood. Ultimately, I think that if you think about kind of our traditional lives as working on these 2 axes between when we focus on private benefit versus social or community benefit, traditionally these things have been pretty bifurcated. That, work was about private benefit. It was about earning wealth or earning a wage or, getting the resources that we needed. And then we normally pursued our social contributions outside of that through not-for-profits, through community groups, being involved in a union, being involved in a political party, work that was largely volunteer-based. And and traditionally the 2 don't mix. People make their money in the top left and then they give it away in the top right, in the bottom right. And so I think what's interesting about social enterprise is it represents the coming together of these 2 things. That can we find ways to create private benefit and social benefit simultaneously? And look, when I say private benefit, I don't mean that you have a desire to become like Jeff Bezos wealthy or anything like that. Private benefit might just mean that you want to be able to do this work sustainably, that you want to be able to earn enough to do it professionally, that social change, that community benefit could actually be your day job and not just something that you do on evenings and weekends around your job. So that's all we mean by private benefit, that it just has to be enough to sustain, the basics of what you need in life. Now, it could also mean making a fortune. And I think there are increasingly ways, we're seeing people increasingly, and we want to see more of this, that are making real wealth from business models and enterprises that are more socially focused than what we've seen in the past as well. So that's what's new about social enterprise. And so when we talk about social enterprise, we mean it very broadly. We literally mean organizations that combine those two elements, that both have an impact model at the heart of their business, how they make a difference, but also a business model, that they are trading. And I always say sometimes it's confusing to understand whether a particular organization is a social enterprise or a charity, because importantly, social enterprise in most parts of the world does not mean an incorporation structure. In some countries, in some states in the US, in the UK, for instance, and other places, there are specific legal incorporation types that represent social enterprise. The B corporations in New York State and elsewhere, the Triple C certification in Europe and the UK and so on. But I'm not using it like that. I'm using social enterprise as a doing, not a being. So you can be a not-for-profit or a for-profit while doing social enterprise. And social enterprise means that you make an impact through trade, that you're ultimately selling a product or service in the marketplace, but something about the way you manufacture, distribute, design, or sell that product or service, or the profits produced go towards social impact. And so our definition encompasses all of these other definitions that you see. You know, you'll often come across more specific definitions where someone says a social enterprise has to be a for-profit, but which is focused on social good, or a social enterprise has to be a charity, but which runs a business. And we say yes to both of those. Those are both forms of social enterprise. Because again, to us, social enterprise is what you do in the world. It's not just kind of a box you tick, or something that you only think about when you are setting yourself up, when you're registering a new company. It's core to actually how you operate in the world. And so very simply, just to keep restating it, you just need those two things. So you need to be trading, i.e. selling something. So I think if you're ever confused about a given organization, are they really a charity or are they really a social enterprise? The trick is to go to their website and see what they're asking you to do. Are they trying to sell you something? Or are they asking you for a donation? And that will basically tell you culturally what camp they're primarily in. There are certainly businesses out there who are doing some trading, but when given the opportunity to make a pitch to you, a new person on their website, they choose to make a pitch, a charitable pitch. And that's totally fine. This is not in any way anti-not-for-profit or anti-charities. We do a lot of work with charities and not-for-profits as well, and I'm a huge believer in the role they play. But this is just to say that if you are relying on donations, you're not a social enterprise. A social enterprise has to be selling something, not just selling goodwill, not just selling, the kind of fuzzy but important feelings of do-goodness that we get from giving donations and philanthropy, but selling us a product or service that we actually want and need, but then embedding within that process their impact outcomes. And so we think, there's obviously a million different business models in the world, but we think there are basically 6 types of impact models, and therefore 6 types of social enterprises. And look, this is just our dichotomy in terms of what we've seen on our platform for almost 10 years and so on. And so I'd be interested if if there's any particular social enterprise that you don't think fit one of these 6 buckets, I'd be curious to hear it. So there's 2 primary genres of social enterprises to us. There's redistributive, which means that they're conducting business in, kind of a pretty kind of normal way, making and distributing and selling a product or service. But then through doing that, they are producing a surplus, which they redistribute towards good causes. So that surplus is often in the form of profit, but sometimes in the form of goods. So you'll sometimes see social enterprises out there who are, selling, widget A or gizmo B or whatever, but they tell you 50% of profits or 100% of profits go towards these causes. So that's a social enterprise, but that's what we call a redistributive social enterprise. The impact is downstream from profits. That's versus an embedded impact social enterprise. And that's where the impacts are upstream of profit. That by the time you come to sell a product or service to someone, the impact has already been created through the manufacturing process, through the jobs that have been created, or through other elements of the business processes. So there are 4 ways in which we see that impact being embedded. The first is in employment. So who gets, who are you creating jobs for? Now, people sometimes say that, all job creation is a social positive, and of course it is, but we have to draw a line somewhere. So when we talk about creating employment as a key mission of a social enterprise, We mean employment for people who are otherwise excluded or who struggle in the traditional labour markets. That if you're just employing people who could walk into any business and get a job, that's not a true social impact. So normally with a social enterprise, you'll see them employing long-term unemployed or young people at risk of homelessness or recently arrived migrants or refugees. Who otherwise, my wife works for a social enterprise called The Social Outfit, which is an ethical fashion company, and they employ women who are recently arrived migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees. And so their social impact is not the clothes; it's who gets to make the clothes. That makes sense. But by buying their clothes, you're supporting that employment generation for women who've only recently come to Australia and need extra assistance and attention to get integrated into the workforce, to find opportunities. The second is an access. And that's often when you reimagine the product itself to make it more accessible to people who've been traditionally excluded. And I'll give examples of this. I'll give a bunch of examples of all of these after this, but a quick example of that might be in Africa. There's been a lot of great enterprises that provide bank-like services using mobile phone networks. Mobile phones as a store of credit, as a way to distribute credit, and so on. So M-Pesa and so on is an example of that. And that's creating access for poor people to banking type services, which they've been excluded before, because the service hasn't been designed in a way that suits someone in that situation. Previously banks have required that you come in with 100 points of ID or whatever the equivalent is, that you have a reasonable amount of money to deposit in your bank account right up front. And that doesn't work for a lot of people in Africa. So reimagining the product can very much change the social outcomes of the product by making it accessible to a new group of people. And then there's products that are just better. And we divide those into better for us and better for the world. So better for us are products designed to help us be healthier, happier, more connected, etc. So think the rise of more like vegan food or alternatives, even lab-grown food. Well, lab-grown meat is more in the better for the world category. That you still get your meat, but by growing it in the lab, there's vastly reduced environmental outcomes from the process of raising meat and protein versus the traditional process of raising cows and sheep. But another example of better for the world might be anything that uses a circular economy, so that is developed out of waste products that would otherwise go towards landfill and waste. So let me give you a bunch of examples to make this more real, if any of these aren't landing in your mind in terms of these six types. Oh, and at the bottom, sorry, blended. We do often see social enterprises that, of course, do more than one of those. And that's cool to see. I will say that it's a mistake we often see people making right up front, is that often, very good people who are doing it for the right reasons, and they're trying to build a business that does the most good possible, which is, of course, an awesome ambition. But in order to do the most good possible, you also need to be a sustainable business if you're a social enterprise. And we see a lot of social entrepreneurs making that really hard for themselves up front by trying to kind of do too much good from day one. So they're a cafe, but which only employs young people who are at risk of homelessness, and which, only uses the most sustainable ingredients and coffees, and which gives away 100% of their profits, and does this and does that. And at a certain point, you're making it just too hard for yourself. And one of the things we recommend is that you get really focused on one particular impact and try and be really good at that. So if your impact is creating jobs for long-term unemployed, well, probably don't give away 100% of your profits as well. You might want to invest those in being able to better support those young people, because that's where you create your impact. Whereas if your impact is that you want to give those profits to a charity so that they can invest in, then you probably don't honestly want to be focusing on employing unemployed young people, because they're going to make it really hard to make that profit. You're going to have to invest a lot in them, which is going to make it less likely that you generate a profit, which is going to make it less likely that you are then able to redistribute those assets to your charity partner. So picking one or the other and then trying to be expert at that, trying to be really good at that. And then as you become more expert at that, and as you build an enterprise that is more efficient, that has better processes, that has a bigger market, that is better known, then you can often add in other types of support as well. Then you can start also giving a charitable donation, or then you can start adding an apprentice program to support people who would otherwise be excluded from the labour market, and you can build on that strong foundation. But I think what a lot of social entrepreneurs do, and like me as well, for sure, is don't get that balance right in the early stages, and therefore make it really hard to build that solid foundation and really hard to gain the resources and the assets and the kind of, you know, the leverage to ultimately make a really big difference. So let's give some examples of these different types of social enterprises just to make it more concrete, if it's not already. So one of the pioneers, I think, of the kind of redistributive model that you're probably familiar with is Tom's Shoes. And if they didn't invent, they at least popularized the buy one, give one model. So for every pair of shoes you buy from Tom's, they give a pair of shoes to someone in the developing world who would otherwise be homeless. There's a number of other companies that have a similar model these days. In Australia, we have Hero Condoms. And for every condom they sell in Australia, they give one out free in sub-Saharan Africa. And they have a sister company called Hers, which is tampons, same model. So that creates that nice link. And one of the cool things about this kind of model is that it gives people a really tangible sense of the impact that they are creating. You know, that when you buy a pair of Tom's shoes, you're able to think to yourself, I just gave a pair of shoes to someone. And so we'll come back to this, but one of the things that's so important in any social enterprise is to be able to articulate the difference you make in a way that makes your customer feel really connected to the impact that is ultimately being created. And this is a really simple way to do that. You know, that you buy this, we give that. And it creates that very direct link. Whereas, I don't know, even if Tom said, you know, we give $10 million a year to development causes, that's cool, but you wouldn't really know how much of that you had contributed when you buy one pair of shoes. Even if they said we give 50% of profits, you don't know what the profit margin is on a pair of shoes. So it makes it kind of abstract. Still significant, still inspiring, but more abstract. Whereas you buy these shoes and we give a pair of shoes is very easy for people to grasp, very concrete. And that's one of the advantages of this model. And then, of course, there's redistributing money. So selling a product, and the product is, you know, a pretty normal product, but the profits go to a good cause. So a great example in Australia is the Great Barrier Beer, or this is from the Good Beer Company. They've got a number of different beers they've released, and all of their beers are linked to a specific cause. So Great Barrier Beer is obviously linked to the Great Barrier Reef, and the profits from this beer go towards the Great Barrier Reef Foundation. And what's really important about these types of businesses, and really all social enterprises, is that you can't get away with a subpar product. I think in a way we're now into what I think of as social enterprise 2.0. Social enterprise 1.0 was a niche. You know, social enterprise isn't new. There have been ethical businesses probably forever, but there's been a very definitive consumer niche that we've known about, you know, that if you read like marketing books and so on, and you know, those books where they divide the whole market up into, you've got the, 15% are aspirational and, 15% status seeking or whatever. There's always been an ethical group within that, but it's been about, depending on what you read, 10 to 15%. And I think a big part of this social enterprise 1.0 was that it was based on that group of people being willing to sacrifice, that they would pay more, that they would sometimes put up with less, that they would go out of their way in order to try and do the right thing. Social enterprise 2.0, I think, is the attempt to get really mainstream. Social enterprises to take over the mainstream, and that requires that in order to do that, you can't require that people sacrifice. So in other words, Great Barrier Beer can't say our beer is not quite as good as other beers, but the profits go to a better cause. That's not going to work. The beer has to be delicious. People aren't going to choose to drink bad beer just in order to send some bits of money to the Great Barrier Reef. People would rather drink good beer and make a donation. That makes sense? I learned this actually early on when I was at university. I ran a dance music production company. So we put on parties and raves, but we gave our profits from most of our big events to youth causes. But I quickly learned that you couldn't sell a party that way. You couldn't say, because people were, naturally pretty selective about what they wanted to do on a Saturday night, particularly our audience, university students and so on. Uni students, if you ask them for a donation straight up, they'll say, I don't have any money. The reason they don't have any money is because they like spending it, going out. But that's important. That's the lifestyle. And we learned you couldn't say, come to a kind of average party, but at least it's a good cause. You had to say, this is the best party in Sydney this Saturday night. There's nowhere else you want to be. If you're into this music or this music, our party is the party for you. And by the way, all the profits go to youth causes. And people would love that, but only once they'd actually kind of decided it was the best party they could go to. And so the product, so Social Enterprise 2.0 is products that are at least as good as, if not better than, mainstream business, but which also provide that social benefit. And so Great Barrier Beer, I think, is a great example of that, because no one's going to drink subpar beer in Australia just for the sake of earning a few dollars. Another great example, you see a lot of bottled water companies. And I think bottled water, I think, is always a great example, because it's an example of something that is actually a net negative. Like, the truth is, we shouldn't buy bottled water. So if you're a socially minded person, don't be fooled into thinking that buying a social enterprise bottled water is therefore a good thing to do. It's still a bad thing to do. Now, if you have to buy bottled water, much better to buy the social enterprise bottled water than any other bottled water, but even better would be to not buy bottled water. So this is an example of, in a way, that not only does the product itself not provide social benefit, it actually provides social, it's actually like a negative environmentally, but they make up for it by redistributing all of their profits. So I think this is why I personally am more excited about the embedded models, because I think the redistributive models sometimes don't put enough focus on the business itself. They don't get us to ask the right questions as to, should we even have bottled water? In some ways, they distract from the real impact of the business through a mechanism that fundamentally is traditional philanthropy. We make money here and we give it away over here. So while that is still social enterprise, to me, it's not really a radical rethinking of how the economy works. It's kind of a slightly more efficient way of doing philanthropy, you know, as a direct pass-through. But, you know, it still says that what's the job of business? The job of business is to maximize profits. And then we happen to give our profits away. And who do we give them to? Charities, because the job of charities is to deal with real world issues. And I respect that. That's still, as I said, better than any other bottled water in the world. But I think that more exciting for me is a business that says, actually, we're going to do the real work. We're not just going to run a business in the normal way and give the profits away. We're going to rethink how you run business and make sure that the way in which we're running our business, who we're employing, how we're making it, the products we're creating, are themselves doing social benefit along the way. And that to me is a more fundamental rethink of the role of business in a society as not just being about profits, even if those profits are used for a good purpose, but rather that the details matter, how we make our profits matter. And so an example of kind of a blended model is so a lot of traditional, what we call op shops in Australia or thrift stores in the US, where they're, you know, selling secondhand donated goods and then using that as a revenue stream for the peak organisation, in this case, St Vincent de Paul's Society, run the Vinnie's op shops in Australia. There's also an element of access here, because obviously a big part of what they do is giving people access to quality goods at a price they can afford. So there's a bit of a blend of both. Whereas Salvo's Legal is a social enterprise, for a very similar organisation, the Salvation Army in this case, and it's a law firm. And here it's not about access. It is just about the profits that they have to promise. This is, you know, even more so than the beer example, that no one's going to choose Salvo's Legal as their law firm if they thought they were getting a subpar level of legal support, just in order to direct some funds towards the Salvation Army. But the only reason you would pick Salvo's Legal is if you are convinced that they are, you know, as good as any other law firm. And so that's their positioning. They're not about like pro bono or low bono. They're a high-end law firm, but where the profits go towards supporting a good cause. Cafes are an interesting example because we've seen a lot of cafes all around the world, social enterprise cafes all around the world have become kind of a very popular model. And they're a funny sort of a model in a way because people often use cafes as a profit-generating activity, you know, that we're going to run a cafe and we're going to give the money towards good causes. The problem with that is that cafes don't tend to run much of a profit. That cafes are very low-margin businesses. So if your only impact model is that we redistribute profits, I think you should at least choose a business that is at least theoretically high profit. Like, to be honest, bottled water is very scalable, but cafes aren't. And yeah, it's been mentioned that the Tom's model, exactly right. So there are all sorts of weird externalities when you're just redistributing stuff. So someone pointed out that the Tom's model has been criticized, and it has, because when you just dump a bunch of free shoes in a given market, you know, even if there are people who do go shoeless, you can guarantee that there are a group of people making their living from making and repairing shoes in any community. And when you simply dump a container load of free shoes in a marketplace, you're actually destroying the livelihood of local people as well. So that's, I think, a good example of how the redistributed model has all sorts of weird externalities, I think. This cafe is in Melbourne called Kinfolk Cafe, and they've gone through an interesting journey where they started as a redistributive social enterprise. They were all about generating profits towards good causes. And over the first 3 years of their life, they generated about $120,000, which is not a huge amount of money given the amount of effort that goes in. It's all volunteer labor, and it's a real labor of love. But it's still a really nice contribution. But then if you dig a bit deeper, you realize that within those first 3 years, they ran 2 big crowdfunding campaigns to support their launch and ongoing activities, and they raised $120,000, or just shy of that, from those crowdfunding campaigns. So in a way, over 3 years, no surplus had really been generated. They'd taken in $120,000 in philanthropic money and had given out $120,000 in philanthropic money. But in order to end up at basically net negative, there'd been like 4 years of 3+ years of effort from a whole bunch of volunteers. So all that human capital was essentially ended up being net negative. And so they've actually shifted now to a model that is about actually providing employment opportunities to people who would otherwise be at risk of long-term unemployment. So they've actually shifted from that redistributed model to that embedded model, where they're now actually kind of trying to do the hard work of supporting people with high needs in terms of employment directly, rather than just through the redistribution of funds. That's always been the model of another well-known Melbourne social enterprise called Street. As it says here, 100% of profits stop homelessness. But they've never given that money away. They've never been about taking their profits and giving it to Charity X over here to deal with homelessness. They actually deal with homelessness themselves by helping kids get off the street, helping them find employment, and giving them jobs and training. And so this sort of a business, it's interesting they say 100% of profits, because the truth is that they've never made a profit directly through their trading activities. That they are a common outcome that we see, which is a bit of a hybrid organization. So while we think of them as a social enterprise, well, they certainly are a social enterprise. They're out there trading very hard. They have a catering business. They do, they have a coffee roaster now. They earn about 2/3 of their funds through trading, and have, at least at the moment, they're about 10 years in, still about 1/3 of their budget covered by philanthropy. But that's still a real social enterprise. But a lot of people don't realize that how many social enterprises do end up with some ongoing philanthropic support, how hard it is to get to 100% earned revenue sustainability, particularly, I'll say, if you do make your impact through employment. As I said, cafes are a low margin business, but on average, the research shows that when your impact is through employment, you can expect at least a 30% increase in costs. It's obviously a lot harder and a lot more expensive to give job to employ young people at risk of homelessness versus young people who've worked in other cafes and just have the skills you need. So by definition, they take people who are unemployable, who couldn't get jobs elsewhere, and then do the really hard work to help them be employable. And then as soon as they reach that kind of high level of skill, they move them on again in order to create a place for someone else. And so on average, those types of businesses normally have a 30% increase in cost. And so in a low margin business like cafes, that makes it almost systematically impossible to get to true earned revenue sustainability. But very few cafes have a 30% profit margin. But from a philanthropic point of view, it becomes a really good investment, because instead of philanthropists having to pay for 100% of this high impact program that creates jobs and training for young people at risk of homelessness, they only have to pay 1/3. And the remaining 2/3 get generated out of the commercial activities. And it's also those commercial activities, of course, that create the space and the platform to do that job training and to give those young people a real job experience that they can then take and get another job. Substation 33 is an electronic waste recycling facility, and it's a good example of ticking multiple boxes. So electronic waste recycling is in and of itself a social or environmental good. It's what we would call better for the world. They're recovering stuff that would otherwise end up in landfill, and dismantling laptops and extracting the reusable components of that, so they don't have to be manufactured again, so we don't have to dig up as many rare earth metals and all of that. They also create employment for people with a intellectual or physical disability, and so they're an employment generator for their local community. And then they also redistribute their profits towards their parent organization, which is YFS, which I forget what that stands for, but as you can say, a YFS social enterprise initiative. So they run a number of social. So they're doing at least 3 of our one redistributive and 2 embedded. And the 2 embedded again are jobs, employment, and better for the world because it's a recycling facility. This is an example of Access. This is a speech therapy app in a mobile phone. This launched through a crowdfunding campaign with us, and it was launched by a guy who himself had overcome a severe stutter. He taught me a lot. I hadn't thought at all about what stutters, what it's like to have a stutter, but it has a really negative impact on people's lives if they don't have the opportunity to overcome it. Big negative impact on their on average educational attainment, and huge negative impact on their employability. For anyone with a severe stutter. But a lot of people don't have, it's not covered by a lot of people's health insurance, if they even have health insurance. In order to go to what is often years of speech therapy, you can imagine how expensive that is, and therefore how many people don't get that opportunity. And so Jack was fortunate. He, had parents who could put him through that level of speech therapy to help him get overcome his stutter, but he wanted to make that more accessible to everyone who needed it. And so he pioneered this speech therapy app that tries to kind of give that speech therapy experience right in people's pocket. Food Connect connects farmers is also Access, because it's Access, it connects farmers with, it's what in America is called CSA, is that right? Community Sourced Agriculture. Develops those direct connections between farmers and local consumers. So it's access of farmers to markets and to more certainty, to not being ripped off by the supermarkets. And it's access from local people to a direct source of nutritious, good food. This is Oceans and Bikinis, who I've also worked with. They're a swimwear line that make their swimwears entirely out of plastics recovered from the oceans. So better for the world. It's not better for you. Nothing magical happens to you if you wear their bathers versus someone else's. But it's better for the world, because when you buy their bathers versus someone else, it helps get those plastics out of the ocean. So ultimately, all these different models come down to what we call a theory of change, which is a little bit of a jargon in the not-for-profit or impact sector. And all it means very simply is your description of how you think you create an impact. That you have a theory that if you're working on a new idea or an idea that you want to grow, it means your theory is that if we could do this thing, whatever that is, it would produce this social outcome. If I could launch this business, I would create these jobs, and I would be able to employ these people who wouldn't be otherwise be able to create jobs. That's all theory of change means. So it's a bit of a jargony political science term, but it just means, that everything's a hypothesis if we're talking about the future. That, everything we're here thinking about and talking about is really about, what we can do next and what we can do better. And that means it's a hypothesis because it hasn't happened yet. And so on a simple level, this is kind of the most simple theory of change you could have. We do this, then this happens, and that helps create the change we want to see in the world. So, we build this speech therapy app that gives a lot of people who hadn't otherwise had access to speech therapy, access for the first time, and that helps them lead happier, more productive lives, gain employment, get into school, etc. Bang, bang, bang. And one of the things we've really observed is that the tighter you can get this, the easier it is for people to understand it. Oops, wrong way. And so that is one of the kind of unfair advantages that redistributive social enterprises have, because they have a simpler theory of change. I think it's a less exciting theory of change. I think it's kind of less meaningful in terms of the big picture of what we're trying to create. My ultimate goal is we want to create a whole different capitalism, with social need and social outcomes right at the heart of all our economic activities. And I don't think redistributive ones kind of lead us towards that. But that, even as I say this, you can see how much more abstract and kind of complicated that becomes versus something like this. This is the thank you water theory of change, literally in 7 words. Ignoring the thank you at the bottom. Your purchase funds water projects, changes lives. Do this, then this happens, then this creates the change you want to see in the world. It's the exact formula we look at above. We do this happens, it helps create the change. And they're able to get it down to 7 words. You can only really do that when you have such a simple model. We take the money and we do good things. Most of what we're doing is going to take more than 7 words. But it's worth, even as we must use more than 7 words often to describe what we're doing, we want to keep it as simple, as close to this as possible, more often than not. So here's a more complicated kind of theory of change, which is Hampton Creek, who they've rebranded since I made this. They're now called Just. So they're a vegan food company, and they started off by making vegan mayonnaise, because their theory of change is, they're a company dedicated to making it easy for good people to do the right thing. Whether you're a hip college student or a single mum raising 2 kids, everyone should be able to eat delicious food that's healthier, sustainable, and affordable. Or Words with Heart, which is a feminist social enterprise stationery company. And they're an example of what we call blended impact. They've kind of got the 3 types of impact, which they describe here. But again, it takes more words for them. So on the one hand, they're good for the world because they only use, they have no trees or native forests are harmed. They're also good, they also have a redistributive element where every stationery product they sell funds education for women and girls in the world. And then they have a better for you element when it comes to young girls because they make more kind of feminist and inspiring stationery than your traditional, princesses and unicorns on the front of girls' stationery. However we define social enterprises, though, as I said, the one thing everyone agrees on is that they seem to be increasing quickly. They're often hard to count because of that lack of just a single registration type. Even in countries that do have a registration type, like even America has the B Corporation, you couldn't say that the number of B corporations equals the number of social enterprises in America because it doesn't even begin to add up. There's a lot of social enterprises that, like we're registered in America, we're an LLC. We're just a normal company type, but we are absolutely a social enterprise, 100% focused on social impact. And there's lots of social enterprises, as I said, which are also structured as charities or not-for-profits or community organizations or co-ops. But just in Australia, they estimate there are at least 20,000 and that they've increased by 37% in the last 5 years. And we really think that's an underestimation. We can't prove that, but just, maybe we're in the social enterprise bubble, but it definitely feels to us like we're moving at an even faster pace than that. And you see that all around you. Another great data point is the rapid growth of B Corps, which is a little bit confusing because there's 2 types of B Corps. The one I mentioned earlier is the certification type that, when you actually set up your company, you choose to be a B Corp rather than a C Corp rather than an LLC. But there's also a third-party certification scheme, also called B Corp, annoyingly, which is a little bit like fair trade. It's managed by an independent organization, in this case, B Lab, and it assesses organizations, or organizations submit themselves to a self-assessment based on 200 different criteria, and you have to get at least 80 out of 200. And it looks at all these different aspects of your business, from the gap between your highest and lowest paid employer to the number of minority-owned or women-owned businesses who are your suppliers, to the amount of leave you give your staff, the amount of volunteer time, all sorts of stuff like that, who you buy your power from, and whether it's sustainable or unsustainable. And the number of B Corps is growing really quickly and getting bigger and bigger. You'll see some big companies here already: Patagonia, Ben & Jerry's, Danone, the massive French dairy company, recently became the world's biggest B Corp. So it's growing quickly. So why is that? That's kind of what social enterprise is and examples of that. But why is this happening now? Why are we moving from, as I said, that niche, that traditional niche, which is not new, but why is it kind of expanding out of that niche so dramatically at the moment? And I think there's kind of 3 key historical factors as to why now is the time for social enterprises. We've seen people's attitudes to business shift incredibly radically in the last couple of generations. I don't even think people realize how radically the average sentiment around the role of business is. It wasn't very long ago that this described the dominant view of the role of business, that the only responsibility of business was to increase its profits. Essentially, that the only responsibility of business was to shareholders, not other types of stakeholders, not staff, community, future generations, or the biosphere, but just shareholders, just people who own stocks. And this was not very long ago kind of the accepted norm in terms of how we thought about business. But this has changed almost completely in the course of a couple of generations. This was a study from Deloitte a couple of years ago. This is millennials in the US, asking them what's their beliefs about the role of business. And you'll see only 7% of them agree with that formerly dominant narrative that businesses exist only to make money for shareholders and aren't responsible for wider context. Fully 93% of millennials in the US believe that business has some sort of a responsibility to their wider communities and stakeholders. And 21% think that should be the core job of a business, that businesses should change everything about the thing they do in order to align with social and environmental needs. So this is where we are, I hope. This is where I think, there's 21% who are trying to build businesses from the ground up based around a social or environmental ethos. that we're trying to build, that's our starting point, and then we build everything around that in order to deliver that at scale and in a sustainable way in the long term. Millennials and Gen Z is where we really see this shift playing out. Now, sometimes people ascribe this to generations. I'm not a fan of generation theory that acts as if generations somehow merge with a different set of values. They don't. They reflect the changing values of a society first. And so we see now that 64% of millennials and Gen Zs say that they won't take a job with an employer if it doesn't have strong corporate social responsibility practices, and 85% believe that companies have an obligation to help solve social problems. In another fascinating study from Deloitte, they studied, this was a little bit hard to read, but they studied millennials who are entering the workforce for companies like Deloitte. So, you know, white collar graduates. And they looked at what keeps them in their first job for more than 5 years versus has them leaving in under 2 years. And so to a company like Deloitte, that's real money. That's core business, you know, is whether they can keep their staff and whether they can attract them. And they looked at the number one reason that people leave. The number one kind of split between people who stay and people who leave was this sense of purpose, was whether they felt aligned with the purpose of their organization. That's huge. And that's hitting the bottom line of companies in a whole new way. Part of why we're seeing this huge upswing in social enterprise is that companies have been pushed. Any company that relies on recruiting high-end graduates, you know, competing for the best and brightest graduates, is discovering suddenly that purpose matters in a way it never did before, because it matters to those graduates. They want to use their lives. They want to use their talents to do something more meaningful. And this is such a shift from how it was in the past. You know, I think traditional philanthropy to me is best represented by this guy. And if we were all in person, I'd try and have some audience interaction, but I'm also running short on time. So I'm just going to tell you who this is. This is Alfred Nobel. You may know him as the guy whose face is on the Nobel Peace Prize. And he endowed the Nobel Peace Prize. But how many of you know how he made his money? Where the money came from that enabled him to endow the Nobel Peace Prize? It's because he was the inventor of dynamite. So probably the single person most responsible for the carnage of the First World War. And after that happened, he felt really bad. I mean, he hadn't been planning. He hadn't been thinking about blowing people up. He was a mining guy. But that's where it ended up. And he felt bad. And he thought, how can I restore my legacy? And so he endowed the Nobel Peace Prize. And this to me is so classically how philanthropy used to work. It's all about what you do with the money, not about how you make the money. That we ignore where the money came from, provided you do something useful with it at the end of your life. So this idea of legacy. And I think it is so counterintuitive that we now give the world's greatest peacemakers a coin with the face of the guy who invented dynamite on it. Like, that is so bizarre when you stop and think about it for a minute. And I think this is one of the fundamental changes, is that people no longer think in terms of legacy. They think in terms of alignment. So legacy used to be, you know, I'm going to do what I need to do. And then you reach a certain point in your life when you decide to give back. I'm on a few not-for-profit boards, and I'm actually still more often than not the youngest person on that board, shockingly. So I'm not that young anymore. But you meet a lot of senior executive types on not-for-profit boards often, and you ask them, why did you decide to get involved? And you still usually hear words to the effect of, well, you know, I've done pretty well in life. And I've reached a stage where I decided it was time to give back. And this concept of time to give back is really old school thinking. It's that bifurcated thinking we looked at the start, that I'm going to spend the first 60 years of my life just looking out for me. And then I reach a certain time where I realize it's time to give back. And what's great about younger generations, anyone younger than me, is they tend not to think like that at all. They tend to think in terms of, what am I doing now? And they get a bad rap for that as being impatient and so on. But, you know, we actually don't have time for patience. We have 10 years to get on top of climate change, if that. We're seeing, you know, we have 10 years to save democracy, if that. We have some real time pressures with the impacts we want to create these days. So we don't have time for complacency or patience. And what's great about these younger generations is they're thinking, what do I need to do? What can I do today that is in line with my values? And that's why instead of waiting till they're 60, they're asking that question in their first graduate interviews. You know, when they're thinking about their first job, they're going, what would I be doing with my talents? What does this company exist for? Do I want to join them? So that's one huge shift from legacy to alignment, to thinking about how our actions match our values here and now, who we work for, who we buy from. This other big shift is the way in which we talk about our values. So our values have shifted, but so too has the way we communicate our values shifted, as we've moved from a world, our communications world, that was dominated by interruption to one that's dominated by interaction. That it used to be that if you just had a big enough budget, you could just get your message out. You could just interrupt enough people. You know, so interruption is television ads. You know, you're trying to watch football and someone pays to interrupt you with a commercial message. Magazine ads, you're trying to read a magazine and someone interrupts you with an ad. Direct mail, you know, you're hoping to get a personal postcard and someone interrupts that with a piece of junk mail. On-street fundraising, you're hoping to go, you're planning to go shopping and someone interrupts you to ask for a donation. All of those are forms of interruption. And interruption favors the people with the budgets because interruption is expensive. Buying those TV ads, buying magazine ads, employing people to go do street fundraising. Today, though, messages spread much more quickly through interaction, through people wanting to spread them to their peers. And that's partly because we have the infrastructure for interaction in a way we never did before. You know, where previously the dominant media types were one way, radio, television, print. Now the dominant media type is two-way, social media. You know, until very recently in human history, only 3 institutions could claim to have had 1 billion relationships, 1 billion connections, and they were the country of China, the country of India, and the Catholic Church. And now we have 5 social media platforms that are 1 billion plus and growing. And so there's a whole new infrastructure now to interact at scale in a way we never could before. And so what messages get shared in this environment? Well, they're messages that tend to be timely, memorable, and trusted. And so this is a world where social enterprises actually have an intrinsic advantage because social enterprises are more timely, more memorable, and more trusted by default than business as usual because they're about more than profits. When you're about a cause, when you're about an impact, people trust you more because you seem to be on their side. It makes your message more memorable. It means your message is not just drink water, but change the world by drinking this water. It means it's more timely because it's about issues, it's about change, it's about the world we want to live in. And so this is where we see, you know, I think one of the great examples, this example is kind of broken, to be honest, by the recent pandemic and the crisis buying of toilet paper. Because I need to come up with a new example, but what I traditionally say, and I'm just going to say it again anyway, like if you can think back 3 months ago when people didn't used to madly share photos of toilet paper on social media, what I would say is, you know, think about the last time you went and bought toilet paper. Did you get home and did you have a strong urge to Instagram your toilet paper rolls? I bet you didn't. The people who do, though, are people who buy who gives a crap toilet paper. They love sharing pictures of their toilet paper. Why do they do that? Because it says more. They're not just saying, I'm a toilet paper user. They're saying, I'm a conscious consumer. I'm someone who cares about others. I'm someone who is trying to do the right thing. And so literally, you know, a product means more. It's literally a different story. And this is why social enterprises have this fundamental advantage in this world, whether it's toilet paper or bottled water, shoes. You know, sometimes they turn products that would otherwise be boring into things that are fundamentally interesting. And we see this all the time with people who are succeeding on our platform. You know, Mighty Good Undies, not just about undies, also about making a difference in the world. Good on you, you know, not just about fashion, it's about fashion without harm, you know, doing the right thing. Stories Food Truck, not just about food, but about the stories and the impact that they create. And Back to Good Beer, not just about drinking, but about saving the reef, 1 beer at a time. And it's not just something anyone can use, not just anyone can switch on the power of social media and sharing. You know, we see social media is also good for exposing BS. When someone tries to use social media on their side but doesn't. My favorite ever example, there's a few great examples of like companies trying to get like some hashtag campaign going and having it be hijacked. McDonald's ran into this a few years ago. My favorite ever example though is the Melbourne taxi industry when they were trying to fight off the incursion of Uber, the arrival of Uber. And as part of their PR campaign, they invited everyone to share their taxi stories. And that went about as well as you could imagine. Because if you don't actually have the right kind of story, inviting people to share it is probably not going to be to your advantage. And so this to me is the perfect storm of what's going on right now. If anyone recalls the great early noughties nautical action movie, The Perfect Storm, you'll recall the perfect storm is when 2 low pressure systems, one catches up to the other and becomes a perfect storm. And I think that's what's going on in our economy, is that the 2 storms are shifts in our values to be more focused on the present and more focused on our alignment and our impact in the here and now. and then changes in the way in which we communicate and share values. And these two things have caught up to each other to become this massive storm that is pushing social enterprise into the mainstream. And so when I think you step back and look at something like the Sustainable Development Goals, which are also on the wall behind me, they're not just the world's greatest social challenges, they're the world's greatest business opportunities. Because businesses are going to be involved in achieving a lot of these. You know, when it comes to zero hunger, that means we need to make enough food for 7.5 billion people. And we need to do that in a way that is sustainable and doesn't undermine all our other goals. Governments are not going to be, and not-for-profits are not going to be growing all that food. Businesses are, fundamentally. Businesses are going to be creating affordable and clean energy. Businesses are going to be creating decent work and economic growth. They're going to be creating industry, innovation, infrastructure, reducing inequalities, building sustainable and smart cities, pioneering responsible consumption and production through circular models. All of this is business challenges and huge business opportunities that if we can solve these, and we, you know, that there are going to be massive opportunities, there are going to be fortunes made. It's not about the fortunes, but you know, what if someone can crack the code on affordable and clean energy for 8 billion people, they're going to do really well. Or sustainable cities, or circular consumption, and so on. And so this is why I'm passionate about business, or social enterprise specifically. My background is, you know, advocacy and not-for-profits and community development. But ultimately, I see the scale of the challenges before us, and I think we need all the tools in our toolkit. And fundamentally, business is a very powerful lever for moving things around, for focusing human effort, for pushing innovation, and ultimately for solving problems for people at scale. And so I just think we need all these tools in our toolkit. It's not about, social enterprise is not better than not-for-profit. It's just another set of tools that are appropriate for certain challenges, many challenges. And so let me just leave you with how. I know we're almost out of time, but for those of you, if you could give me another 8 minutes, I'm just going to share a few thoughts on how you can launch your social enterprise and what the next steps might be. And I want to talk particularly about funding options in the early stages, because people think a lot about that. But I think people often don't think about the diversity of options before them. So let me get these out. So in terms of types of funding, there are a few different types of funding that you can think about. Philanthropy is people giving you money for the cause. Equity investment is people becoming co-owners of your business. Debt is obviously money that needs to be repaid. There's two types of debt. Secured means there's an asset that you've put up, so a house, a car. Unsecured means no asset. If you're not able to repay the loan, the person who lent you the money just misses out, is out of luck. And then sales, to start selling or even pre-selling the thing that you're developing. Now, that's good. We think people spend a lot of time often thinking about the first couple because they feel like free money. But they're not. They're not free money. They bring significant conditions with them. But also, you're often not in the right position to go after. So a lot of people waste a lot of their energy trying to get funding that they're not ready to get, in my experience. Hoping to get a grant, hoping to get an impact investor, and using a lot of their, their ingenuity, their energy, their entrepreneurial energy, chasing those things. We're big believers, it's not for everyone, but in focusing on sales first. Because that is not only about money, it's actually about data. Because when you're in the very early stage of a social enterprise, you may think you need money, but what you actually need is data. You need to know whether your product or service is going to work, whether people want what you're offering. What's great about sales as a fundraising strategy is that it also lets you figure out if people are actually willing to buy the thing that you're offering. So that if you succeed, you not only have money, you have a lot more confidence than you had in the past and a lot more evidence that you're on the right track. And you can often then use that evidence to go back to the philanthropy or the impact investors and try and get them on board once you have that data, once it's more than just a hope and a prayer or a dream. But once you've thought about this type of funding, the question then becomes, who could you get that funding from? And it's really worth, I think, thinking about these as in these slices: types of funding, person providing the funding, mechanism, which is where we'll get next to get the funding. So there's obviously foundations and high net worths or aid organizations in the philanthropic world, and they in and of themselves are quite different. Foundations are, structured organizations that have taken donations from other people and have to report back to them. High net worth individuals is a fancy way of saying rich people. So that's their money, and sometimes there's an opportunity for them to be more radical or risk-taking with that money, but they're hard to get to, obviously, under a lot. Everyone wants their attention and their money. Aid organizations are a particular opportunity when you work in the developing world. That there is actually quite a lot of aid and philanthropy to support early stage social enterprises in a development context. Then there's impact investors. Strategic partners is when you're building with a partner. A big part of our business these days is running accelerators and funding programs on behalf of partners, foundations, governments, and corporates. And we kind of co-designed that model with our first major partner, ING. We never would have actually thought of it or invented it on our own. It was by like doing that together that we actually ended up with a whole new kind of product, a whole new part of our business that has been very significant to us since then. So that's when you essentially find one major potential purchaser or partner, and you say, what could we build it for you? What do you need? And you use their resources and support to build the thing they need. The 3 Fs, family, friends, and fools, often provide the very first funding into organization. The very first funds into StartSomeGood was my dad and my co-founder's dad giving us a little bit of money, and obviously we're very privileged and fortunate that we have families who are able and willing to support us in that way. But that's not so unusual. And then customers, to come back to sales ones. And then there are accelerators, and there's banks and consumer credits and a few other options like that. And then the how. And so this is where direct negotiation via an intermediary, using a platform or winning a competition. So using a platform. And so let's say you wanted to crowdfund using a platform. Too many people start with that. They think to themselves, I'm going to crowdfund, rather than what I need is to raise some early seed money from my family and friends. What's the easiest way to do that? I'm going to use a crowdfunding platform. Or what I need to do is to test my product proposition. So I want to run a pre-sale campaign to identify my early adopters and hopefully get some money in the door to pay for manufacture. How can I best do that? I'm going to use a crowdfunding platform. In other words, crowdfunding should be an answer to an existing question, not the question. I used to see this a lot in social media. I did in 2008 to 2012, I was doing kind of social media consulting for not-for-profits and charities. And a lot of people would say things like, how can we use Twitter? And that's the wrong question. Twitter needs to be an answer to a question, not the question. The question might be, how can we better connect with our community to provide real-time information? Twitter can do that. Or how can we build more of a profile as a thought leader? Potentially Twitter could do that. Do you see what I mean? Twitter needs to be the answer, not the question. And a lot of people do the same thing with crowdfunding. They think, should I crowdfund? But it's not a question on its own. It needs to be the answer to the question. Crowdfunding can happen at a bunch of different stages. Crowdfunding is a great way to do a pre-sale campaign. It's a great way to rally money together from your family and community as kind of seed money in that early stage. It can be a great way to do even impact investment today on an equity platform. But you should have already figured out what you want to do before you figure out how you plan to do it. This is probably you guys will get access to the replay on this and the slides, so maybe I'll leave you to study this on your own time. I know it's complicated. What I wanted to say though is that you can look at impact investing in a few different lenses, and realistically what's out there is mostly financial first. So people talk about finance first is when someone wants the same financial outcomes as a non-impact investment, but they also want impact. What I would love to see more of is impact first, which is someone who wants a return, but is prepared to take a lesser return than a commercial investment in return for impact. There is too little of that. Most of what we have is, in order to get impact investment, you could actually raise a non-impact investment because you've just met the criteria for investability. What's missing from this whole graph is, and which is so important when we're talking these early stages, is risk. Is that across all those different investments, there's too little money at the early stage. There's too little risk capital. There's no equivalent in the social sector of the role that angel investors play in the commercial startup space. A group of people who are hungry to take high risk bets on interesting, innovative projects. There's vanishingly few of those when it comes to social impact. And that's really the role that crowdfunding is playing, is filling that kind of angel investor gap, that early stage risk tolerant capital. I'm breaking it down to our individually acceptable, give you $50,000. But it becomes a lot easier if I can give you $50 and be joined by another 999 people so that you have resources you need. If it doesn't work, that's a bummer, but I've only lost $50. So, it becomes a lot easier to support more interesting innovative ideas when you can break it down in that way. And that's fundamentally what crowdfunding is doing. And it's why it's helping fill this gap for risk-tolerant funds for social innovation, for new ideas and new projects. And so a lot of what we're seeing these days is people trying new ideas through things like crowdfunding as a way of testing their proposition with the community, and then taking the data from that and going to one of those more institutional investors. In much the same way as in the commercial startup world, people often get their first funds from angels, then they run kind of essentially an MVP or a pilot, minimum viable product, or a pilot, or they do some stuff that creates some evidence, and then they take that evidence and they go to venture capitalists and VCs and get those bigger chunks of money. In the social sector, that tends to be, early stage business activities, crowdfunding and the like, or even testing the proposition at one shop or in a stall or something like that. And then going to those institutional partners. And so I want to just leave you with our formula. I know we promised a formula at the start. We do have a formula. I'm getting to it now at the end for successful crowdfunding, because really this is the launch formula. We developed this in the context of crowdfunding, but it's not, crowdfunding is just very focused, like 30 days, and it works or it doesn't. But it's the same regardless of whether you're crowdfunding. There are 5 key things that you need to get right in order to introduce your idea and have people want to support and want to be part of it and to believe you. And so we call these the 5 C's of successful crowdfunding. But you can think of them as the 5 C's of successfully launching anything. Even if you're just opening the doors of a shop, or you're releasing a movie, or you're hosting a festival, it's the 5 C's of pitching an idea that people want to be part of. And the first is clarity. Obviously, if I don't really understand what you're trying to do, it's going to be really hard for me to get excited about it or want to be part of it. So clarity is about articulating your theory of change, as well as your product value proposition in a way that is really clear and intuitive. The more intuitive, the more simple, often the better. So clarity allows me to understand what you're doing, but credibility is what allows me to believe you. It's all very well that you might have a spectacular idea, but if it's not pitched to me in the right way or in the right context with the right signals, if you write your fantastic idea on an A-frame that you're wearing and you're standing on a street corner ringing a bell saying, I've got an awesome idea, most people are going to walk around you and ignore you because you're going to present like a crazy person. And crazy people don't have any credibility. And so credibility is about signaling that you're the right person to take this idea forward. And we haven't got time to go into it in this presentation, but we have a 5 P's of credibility, which is people, partners, progress, promises, and the past as different ways in which you can signal. So if you have all the great skills and track record, that's people, that's awesome. A lot of people don't know. And you have to think about how to bring in that credibility through partners, for instance, through endorsement, through progress that provides evidence of what you're trying to do. But however you do it, credibility is absolutely crucial for anyone kind of going on the journey with you. The third is communities. And what we really mean by that is carefully chosen communities. That you need to be really clear on who your target market is, who it's for and who you're trying to reach. And this is where so many things fall down, particularly in the social impact area, because so many social entrepreneurs have highly universalist ideas. You're launching a vegan food company and it's for everyone because you think everyone should be a vegan. You're launching an ethical fashion company and it's for everyone because everyone should wear ethical fashion. That's true, but also not useful in the context of a launch. Even if hypothetically, you're never going to reach everyone no matter what you do, but even if in theory, 20 years from now, you might literally have been a monopoly provider of ethical fashion on Earth or something, it's going to take time to get there. Even if the product is for everyone originally, the launch is not for everyone. The launch has to be for a group of people who are going to be willing to connect early, who are going to take risks, who are going to really get it. Who's the sweet spot, essentially? That's who you need to focus on around your launch. It's not for everyone. It's for a carefully chosen community of early adopters that you're trying to cultivate. The fourth is channels. So if you can think of the first two, credibility and clarity and credibility are like the attributes of the story. Are you telling a story that I get, that I believe, etc.? Communities and channels are the outreach campaign. So you need clarity on who you're trying to reach. And once you figure out who that is, then you need to map out the channels that will allow you to reach them. Different groups of people use different types of media in different ways. And so you need to become an expert at your target market so you know how to reach them. And that will be about choosing the right collection of channels that will help deliver your message. Maybe that's in person. Maybe you're going to travel around and speak at lots of live events. Maybe it's going to be through through school communities and using that infrastructure. Maybe it's going to be through social media. But which social media? Maybe you're very video inclined. Maybe it'll be on TikTok and YouTube. Versus, you're more professional in what you're talking about, so you're going to use LinkedIn and Twitter. But figuring out the right channels, not for you, but for your carefully chosen community. Too many people just use the channels that they are most familiar with, even if they're a mismatch for the community they're trying to reach. And then finally, courage, which is what makes all of this work. The rest is just planning. The rest is just in theory. You could have a great pitch that is clear and credible. You could have a great outreach plan with a carefully chosen community and mapped out channels. But if you don't do the work, nothing magical happens. So you need the courage to step out and make that happen. You need the courage to share your ideas and your vision and your dreams with people. You need the courage to risk public failure, because it's the only way you can achieve that public success. And so I want to just leave you with a few things to think about as you contemplate the next steps in your journey. First, what is your structure? You know, not-for-profit, for-profit, B corporation. I'm a believer in deferring this decision as long as possible. That, you know, wait until you don't need to be anything at first to start pitching your idea, to start building, you know, to start building your community, to start building alliances. If someone wants to give you a donation, you maybe want a not-for-profit structure. If someone wants to make an investment, you probably want a for-profit structure. If no one wants to do either of those, you could just stay as a sole trader for now, as you, until you're forced to go one way or another. So be careful about what stage are you at. And one way to think about this is how much credibility do you have right now? And try and be realistic. I know it's hard to assess our own credibility. Like, your friends and family think you're great, but if you were just to jump up and pitch your idea to a group of strangers, how would you signal to them that you're worth paying attention to? Would you be able to point to your own track record? Would you be able to point to some key partners? Would you be able to point to the progress you've made with your idea so far? That, you know, you're launching a fashion company, so you made a line of t-shirts and you sold them to your friends and they all loved them, and that's why you want to take the next step. What could you use to evidence that you are the right person for someone to pay attention to? And if you've got none of those things yet, they're probably what you need to focus on next. And so what is the next step you need to take? Do you need to get some partners on board? Do you need to test something? You know, do you need to, maybe if you're already in market, you're focusing on consistency of sales, consistency of delivery. Once you've got consistency down, you're probably looking to scale into new markets. But where are you? And as I said, what I find is a lot of people at the validation stage, but are trying to scale straight away, but they're not at that stage yet. They need to prove that their idea works, that their product works, that there's a market that wants it. How much funding do you need? Not just later, but now. Again, a lot of people, you know, we see a lot of people come to our crowdfunding campaign with like, I need $1 million to launch this company globally. And we're like, do you really need $1 million? Because like, it's really hard to raise $1 million. What do you really need right now? You'd like $1 million. $1 million would be awesome. But what's the actual next step you need to take? And how much money is that going to take? A great way to think about this is a concept I've stolen from Seth Godin, for anyone who knows him, but they use the phrase minimum viable product a lot in the startup world. He talks about minimum viable market, which I like, because that's about having that real focus on that core community, that carefully chosen community. What's the minimum number of people you need to buy your thing to get started? Maybe it's 100 people. You don't need huge numbers necessarily. So you can get really focused. If you only need 100 people, then maybe don't launch, you know, meal kits just for the average family. Launch meal kits specifically for people who are celiac. You know, like who are curated, you know, because that could be your minimum viable market. It's just celiacs at first. Oh my God, sorry, let's hold this off. And take it from there. And then what else do you need? Because again, we find a lot of people thinking about money when in fact what they really need is training, mentorship, connections, partners, the opportunity to spend a bit more time designing the product, etc. And so before I leave you, I just want to let you know just a touch about our Good Hustle program, which is designed to help you answer all these questions and to design a clear pathway towards launching or growing your social enterprise. It brings together kind of everything we've learned over 10 years, helping people launch their social impact ideas, and is a 10-week online cohort-based program. So what's really, it's got a couple of key attributes. The first is that it's taught entirely by founders. So we have 9 teachers. We have 10 weeks split into 5 modules, almost all of them taught by a different expert, and every single one of them is a founder of a social enterprise. So we take a real founders teaching founders approach, and we've curated, you know, we don't think we're the experts at every piece of this, not the best experts, you know, and so we've tried to curate from our networks and partners who are the best people for each piece. Who's the best person we know for teaching pitching, for teaching human-centered design, for teaching defining your target market. And so then it's broken into 10 clear steps that work through essentially impact first, then product, then market, then launch strategy, and then personal sustainability. Because one of the main reasons that the enterprises don't make it is founders burn out. And so actually building self-care routines and thinking about how you're going to be healthy and, you know, maintain your wellness through the process is really important. We kick off the next cohort next week. So I'd love you to check it out at goodhustle.online. And if you have any questions at all, you can write to us at goodhustle@startsomegood.com. with any questions you have or following. You would have had emails from us through this for this webinar, no doubt. So please, there are payment plans available. If that suits you more, we'd love to have you join the team. And you work, as I said, it's not just about working with those other founders, it's about working with your peers who are also in this early stage of the journey through peer support groups, live calls, live group coaching, and so on. And so ultimately the thought I want to leave you with, and then I'll kind of dismiss the class, but you're also welcome to hang around and ask any questions. I'm sorry I didn't leave more time for that. I got too chatty. But to me, it's exciting that we can use business to create the future we want, but I think it's even more important to realize that we must use business to create the future that we want, because creating that future is going to take all the tools in our toolkit, not just the traditional government, charity, and not-for-profit tools, but business tools as well, to actually design a better economy, to design better products, to bring everyone into economic opportunity, and ultimately to build a new economy that is hopefully sustainable, capable of sustaining on a finite planet. So thank you all for joining me today. I really appreciate that.
Well, thanks everybody for tuning in and listening to what Tom had to share. Sorry that he couldn't be here live with us, but like, as you heard, there's a lot of great value in the insights he was sharing. And I personally love how the typology of the 6 types of social enterprises, it really helps me figure out like where do different companies fit, and helps me when I'm working with people to figure out, well, what are they really trying to do and what are the methods they're using to do that. So thank you for tuning in. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll see if we can get Tom on a call to answer some of those. Otherwise, we'll see you hopefully tomorrow morning. We have Tiffany from One Hope Wine, who'll be talking about their impact model and how they've developed their purpose-driven business. So thanks for being here, and we'll see you at the next session. Bye-bye for now.